Hi, I'm Jim Ward of the Middle Country Public Library, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode in our History Bites series. Today we will discuss the Blackout of 1965, one of the biggest power failures in history that occurred in New York State, portions of 7 nearby states, and parts of eastern Canada, plunging them all into darkness. At about 5:15 p.m. Eastern Time, half an hour after sunset, the lights began to flicker on and off in New York City. The New York Times would later describe it as a, quote, wild flickering for about a minute, like a silent alarm, end quote. 12 minutes later, just as millions of New Yorkers were starting home from work, the city went totally black. It was Tuesday, November 9th, 1965, and the beginning of the biggest, most famous blackout this country has ever seen. It wasn't just New York City either. Much of the northeastern U.S. had gone dark, parts of 9 states plus 3 Canadian provinces. In all, some 30 million people were left stumbling around trying to remember where they'd last seen their candles and matches. In Manhattan alone, 800,000 people were stuck in subways, thousands more in elevators. With stoplights being out of order, ordinary citizens were now directing traffic. Doctors were delivering babies and performing surgery by flashlight. My father, Gerard Ward, was taking the subway to Richmond Hill, South Ozone Park area where his car was parked. He boarded the train about 5:20 p.m., and after entering the tunnel under the East River, the train came to a stop. Somewhere around 8:15 p.m., the passengers were told they would be leaving the train via the front door and stepping onto the tracks. My dad and the others were told there was no lighting, but they would be led by an employee with a flashlight, so they were to hold on to the person in front of them. My dad remembers being told that there was an electric blackout in New York City. That caused some concern to several of the passengers who had been talking about possible attacks and bombs. They eventually came to an exit, which was a step up to a little ledge where a ladder had to be climbed into a small square concrete room, which had a smaller ladder that took them out of a grating onto a sidewalk in Brooklyn. My dad drove he and a coworker home, and my dad didn't get home until about 3:30 a.m. My mother, Phyllis Romano, was coming home from work in Manhattan when her train pulled into the Knickerbocker Street station. It sat there for quite a while, and no one knew what was going on. When she looked out of the window, it was complete pitch black. After a while, they were told there was a complete blackout over the whole eastern seaboard, including Canada. My mother was very thankful they were at a station, so they allowed everyone to get off the train. She was 4 stops from where she usually gets off, so she walked, which was probably about 2 miles. Luckily, she met her brother's friend, so she wasn't alone. It was so dark except for streetlights. Thankfully, she got home safely. For the New York-based news media, this was the story of a lifetime. The problem was that getting the story out depended on the very commodity that made the news in the first place: electricity. For the 3 big television networks, the nation's most popular source of news, the timing could hardly have been worse. CBS, for example, was forced to shift its nightly broadcast to a backup studio in Washington, while anchor Walter Cronkite, stuck in New York, delivered the blackout story by telephone. NBC had lost power, but emergency generators were turned on, and the network was able to activate a small studio. The problem was that the millions of TV sets in homes throughout the metropolis couldn't receive a program since there was no electricity. But NBC decided to do a broadcast anyway. By candlelight, NBC anchor Frank McGee talked about the blackout in a program sent by line down to Washington. Jim Hartz reported about his travels through the congested streets of Manhattan. NBC's Gabe Pressman reported that one thing that struck him was how people were pitching in to try to help. There were New Yorkers at nearly every major intersection along 5th and 6th Avenues acting as volunteer traffic cops. They were trying to keep the traffic moving, but also looking out for the interests of pedestrians. The crowds were orderly. It was almost impossible to get a cab. Many commuters tried to make arrangements to stay overnight in Manhattan. There were lines at hotel reception desks. The sidewalks were brimming with people, but there was a spirit of camaraderie in the air. It was New York at its best, showing a spirit of survival and innovation. Radio, however, rose to the occasion. Battery-powered transistor radios could still pick up the news as long as stations had backup generators to transmit it. One prominent magazine would later refer to the blackout as, quote, the day of the transistor, end quote, and radio's greatest hour since D-Day. More than any other medium, it was radio that allayed people's worst fears, and in 1965, those could get pretty bad. The Cold War between the US and Soviet Union remained icy, and movies about nuclear Armageddon like Failsafe and Dr. Strangelove, both released a year earlier, were all too fresh in memory. Quote, "Was there anyone whose mind was not touched, at least fleetingly, by the conviction that this was it, that the missiles were on their way, and doomsday was at hand?" End quote, The New Yorker, a magazine not known for hysteria, asked in its next issue. Though no one knew exactly what had happened, thanks to radio, the government was able to reassure Americans about what hadn't. The country was not under attack. Meanwhile, the newspapers were doing what they could to get the story. At the time, New York City had 6 major daily papers, twice the number it has today. But only one, The Times, would put an edition out the next morning. Working by the light of candles scrounged from nearby hardware stores, restaurants, and even churches, Times reporters and editors put together their November 10th edition, which a publisher in New Jersey, unaffected by the outage, graciously agreed to typeset and print. The result, as Arthur Gelb, a Times editor, recalled it in his memoir City Room, was a, quote, "bizarre 10-page edition in Times style and Newark News type," end quote. Not surprisingly, the contents fell a bit short of the news's all the news that fits the print motto. A few pages of Blackout and other news, the stock tables, a crossword puzzle, the bridge column, and some additional odds and ends. Plus, in a spirit of optimism, the next day's TV listings. 5,000 police officers were summoned to duty, and 10,000 National Guardsmen were called up. The New York Times' iconic reporter, Peter Kiss, wrote, quote, "Thousands of persons hiked across the Brooklyn and Queensboro bridges. On the Queensboro span, cars crawled behind the trudging pedestrians. 5 hours after the blackout, the police reported 5 arrests on looting charges. There were some reports of minor vandalism, but generally New Yorkers appeared to have been on their best behavior." Power had been restored to most of the city by 7 a.m. on November 10th, roughly 14 hours from the first flicker. But questions about the calamity's cause, plus a seemingly endless supply of human interest stories, would fill the papers for days. The picture that emerged was of a night of blackout but geniality, inconvenience but indomitable spirit. There was, for example, the widely told tale of the 11-year-old New Hampshire boy who happened to whack a stick against a light pole at the precise moment the power failed, then scurried home, terrified that he had caused the whole thing. And the story about the lights going out at Carnegie Hall in the middle of a performance by the pianist Vladimir Horowitz, who finished a piece of Chopin without missing a note. And the one about the Scandinavian Airways pilot who saw the landing lights of Kennedy International Airport at one moment, glanced down for an instant to check his instruments, and looked up to find the runway had gone totally dark. Though an estimated 500 flights had to be diverted because of the blackout, there were no accidents, a happy fact later attributed to a clear sky and a full moon. Other accounts involved great masses of people. Thousands had hunkered down for the night on the floors of train stations, hotel lobbies, and department stores. Macy's alone fed an estimated 4,000 to 5,000 stranded shoppers in its cafeteria, after which many hit the sack in the bedding department. Even criminals seemed to have gotten into the spirit. While there were some reports of looting and other mayhem, the crime rate was reportedly down for the night, although some of that may have had to do with the increased police presence. Before the week was out, the official explanation for the blackout arrived. A faulty relay in Ontario, a device roughly the size of a light switch, had caused power stations throughout northeastern North America to shut down one after another. This was perhaps the first time most Americans had heard the term power grid, the complex interconnected system that provides the power to keep our lights on. Before the week was out, the official explanation for the blackout arrived. A faulty relay in Ontario, a device roughly the size of a light switch, had caused power stations throughout northeastern North America to shut down one after another. This was perhaps the first time most Americans had heard the term power grid, the complex interconnected system that provides the power to keep our lights on. Though the blackout soon faded from the news, it retained a place in popular culture. Hollywood would turn it into an amiable farce called Where Were You When the Lights Went Out with Doris Day and Robert Morse. Years later, Mad Men creator Matthew Weiner would consider ending his series with an episode involving the blackout before deciding that things would go better with a Coke. A report that an unusual number of babies were born 9 months to the day of the blackout became an urban legend that still lives on, although a University of North Carolina sociologist analyzed the data and convincingly debunked it in 1970. To this day, however, the blackout remains beloved by UFO buffs. They cite numerous well-documented reports of mysterious fireballs and other aerial oddities in the skies before, during, and after the event, including some in the vicinity of the Ontario Power Station. For the skeptics, a simple switch wasn't enough to explain one of the wildest, weirdest nights of the 20th century, and still isn't. The blackout of 1965 would come to be known as the Good Blackout. In historic terms, it turned out it was not New York's worst blackout. The blackout of August 14, 2003, affected 50 million people, but the 1965 incident was notable in that it made New Yorkers and the nation as a whole realize how vulnerable we were to power failure. Thank you for joining us for today's episode. If you enjoyed it, click like, and if you watched on YouTube, hit subscribe. Thanks so much, and we'll see you all next time.